Great. Well, it's great to have Stephen Lindemann here with us today, helping us think into the assessment interview process. Now, Steve has grown up in Hawaii and in Brazil. He's the son of a missionary and a pastor from the States, and has worked for over 26 years in human resources in a range of areas, and has settled more recently into the role of being a consultant in leadership development. He had the role for a number of years as the Director of International HR Strategy at Microsoft. So it's great to have Stephen here sharing his experience and his knowledge so that, God willing, we can be better assessors and have a better behavioural assessment interview. So, Steve, it'd be really helpful for you to kick off and tell us about a behavioural interview.
Sure.
What is it? Tell us its purpose.
Sure. Okay, thanks. What I'd like to do is probably start off just by talking about why do we do interviews at all? What's the purpose of interviews? It's such a part of the fabric now of any kind of organization that we just accept them as fact. And people just think, oh, you got to interview somebody before you hire them. And on one level, that's true. But because it's become so commonplace, we run the risk of being complacent about it. So I think it's good to sort of step back and say, well, what is it we're actually trying to achieve? At the risk of sounding pretentious, I'd like to actually give you a quote to start off with, which I think really summarizes the importance of doing interviewing really well. And I'm going to read it so I don't get it wrong. So this is from Werner Heisenberg. He's a famous German physicist, the father of quantum physics, and also the father of the uncertainty principle, which is kind of quite relevant to what it is we're talking about today. Nobel Prize winner. So this is what he said, and with respect to his field of study. We have to remember that what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. And I think that's quite an interesting statement and somewhat profound, because what it's essentially saying is we bring a high degree of subjectivity to any interaction. And if he as a physicist could say that, just think about those of us who are working with human beings, and working with human behavior. It's even more important that we recognize the subjectivity we bring to the equation. So with that as a background, what I'd like to suggest is the best way to determine whether somebody is suitable for a particular role, be it a church planter or anything else for that matter, is to actually watch them doing it. So ideally, we would get alongside somebody and spend some time observing them real time. Now, practically speaking, that's not possible, although in some cases it might be. But for most organizations, that's not a practical way to assess. So what I would suggest people do is just work backwards from the ideal. If that's the ideal, then how close can we get to the ideal without necessarily using up incredible amounts of resources and time to do so? So the next best thing would be to observe somebody in a simulated environment that's as close as possible to what it would be that they would be doing in the real job. And that's why you have a lot of organizations now that are doing simulations. They set up a scenario where somebody is having to go through the motions of doing a typical role. That's probably the most reliable method of assessment that is in use today in most contexts. But even that requires a fair bit of time and investment. Although these days, with economies of scale, there's a lot of people out there that can do that sort of assessment fairly effectively and in a fairly timely way. But the next best thing beyond that, then, if you're coming back closer to reality, would be a behavioral interview. And the emphasis is on the word behavior, because what we're trying to do is, as much as possible, determine to what extent will this person behave in a particular way in the context we want them to perform their duties. And so the focus is on not theoreticals, not hypotheticals, not ifs, ands, or buts, but what have you actually done? So what they've actually done is a better predictor of what they will do in the future. That's the core concept of a behavioral interview. And being able to do that in an interview well is a really important step in the overall assessment process.
So the focus is looking at past behaviour to predict future performance. Now, is any behaviour off limits in a behavioural assessment interview?
Not really, insofar as long as you know what behaviors you're targeting. So if you go into a behavioral interview as the interviewer or the assessor without a really clear understanding of what behaviors you're looking for, then it's just going to be all over the place. You're going to be wasting your time, essentially. But if you know what behaviors you're looking for, and you've done the hard work up front, and you've got a short list of behaviors that are important for successful performance in the job, then within that context, nothing should be off limits. You should feel free to be able to zero in on as many of those behaviors as you possibly can in order to ensure that the person can actually deliver.
So what are we looking to achieve at the end of a good behavioural interview?
What you're looking to have at the end of a good behavioral interview is as much factual, objective data as possible about how that particular person in the past has actually done things that are as similar as possible to the things you expect them to do in the future. That's a mouthful. And it's probably harder to do than even it is to say. Because to do that really well, you need to be able to ask very good, open-ended questions, and you need to be able to guide the interviewee, the person being assessed. You need to be able to guide them in their responding so that they give you the facts that you need in order to be able to make an objective assessment at the end of the day. So I'll just give you an example. If, for example, we're trying to assess whether or not somebody is very good at resolving conflict, and if we just start with a relatively good open-ended question, tell me about a time where you had to resolve conflict in your team. And the individual might give you, a fairly okay, broad response to that. They might talk about a time the team had a disagreement and they had to guide them to a successful conclusion. That in itself is interesting, but it doesn't really get at sufficient detail, in my view, to provide you with sufficient data to say that they could actually do that in a consistent way going forward. So you might want to follow up your initial broad question about, tell me about a time, blah, 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 with, okay, that's interesting. I understand the context, but what specifically were you trying to achieve? So you're going from just the situation or the context to the actual task. So they might give you some good information about the tasks they're trying to achieve within that context. And then you think, okay, that's helpful. I now understand the tasks, but what specific actions did you take? And this is a really important point, because often this is where people will start to talk about things that were achieved that others may have actually done. And they'll use terms like, well, we did this, or they did this, or this is what happened. And what you really need to know is, okay, that's fine, but what did you specifically do to bring that about? Were you actually responsible for that action, or was somebody else and you just kind of went along for the ride? And that's where often behavioral interviews can get tripped up, if we're not getting them to be as specific as possible. But even that's still not enough. So if we finish the acronym, and you probably already figured out I'm spelling out STAR, S-T-A-R, so we're up to the A, which is the action. Ultimately, we end up with what was the result. And again, this is a classic hurdle that people sometimes trip over. All right, that's all good. Man, we know what actions you took, but did it turn out the way you wanted it to? It might have just blown up in their face. And if we just stopped with that initial question, just tell me about a time where you had to resolve conflict, then you got this very vague, broad response that sounded good. You would have thought, tick, let's move on to the next behavior that we want to assess. And you really wouldn't have understood whether that person actually was able to be successful in that situation.
So in some ways, a bad example is actually a helpful. Is a helpful example.
It can be.
Would you then press into a positive example where it has worked, or where you have achieved your task?
That's a great question. So let's say that they came to the end of the STAR and they've given you the result and it was a successful outcome. So you feel good about that. You're probably entitled to tick that one off. But let's say they got to the end of it and it didn't quite turn out the way they had hoped. Some people might say, oh, bad example, gee, cross that one out. But in actual fact, if you were to ask one final question, and this is where my acronym falls over a bit, it's L for what did you learn. STAR doesn't sound as good as STAR. But if you were to ask one final question, is okay, maybe that didn't turn out the way you had initially intended, although your actions actually made sense, it was logical, your approach seemed quite, a sensible approach, but the result wasn't quite there. What did you learn from it? If the person can then turn that around and say, well, actually, this is what I learned, and the next time it happened, this is what I did. So to me, that's a save, and I think that's a really important thing for us as assessors to keep in mind. Nobody's perfect. What we're looking for here are behaviors that exhibit the ability to learn from past mistakes and be able to leverage those learnings in a future potentially novel context. To me, that's probably even more powerful than somebody who thinks they get it right all the time. So if you use that method of questioning within the behavioral interview model, I think you'll end up with much better data. Back to your original question you asked 5 minutes ago, you'll end up with much better data at the end of it to objectively assess whether or not this individual in the future is likely to be able to exhibit the behaviors you need for the job.
Great. That was excellent. In our next video, we're going to look at how to run a behavioural assessment interview and the STAR process, or the STAR process, as Steve just explained.